It was a quiet evening in a suburban neighborhood just outside Washington, D.C. The air was cool, and the streets were calm, with only the occasional sound of a car driving by or someone walking their dog. This peaceful setting seemed far removed from the chaos of big city life. But on this particular night, something happened that would shake not only the community, but also the entire nation. General Patricia Monroe, a highly respected officer in the U.S. Army, was returning home after attending an official military event. She had spent decades serving her country, rising through the ranks to become one of the highest-ranking black women in the history of the armed forces. Her uniform was immaculate, decorated with medals and badges earned through years of dedication and sacrifice. It was more than just clothing. It was a symbol of honor, discipline, and hard work. As she pulled into her driveway, she felt a sense of relief. The evening had been long, filled with speeches, handshakes, and formalities. All she wanted now was to step inside her house, take off her shoes, and unwind. Little did she know, her night was about to take a turn she could never have imagined. Just as she stepped out of her car, two police officers approached her. Their flashlights shone directly at her face, making it hard for her to see clearly. One of them called out, "Ma'am, can you explain what you're doing here?" His tone was sharp, almost accusatory. General Monroe paused for a moment, surprised by the question. After all, she was standing in front of her own home, a place she had lived in for years. She calmly replied, "This is my house. I live here." Then, noticing their skeptical expressions, she reached into her bag to pull out her identification. As she did so, she noticed how tense they became. "I'm a general in the U.S. Army," she added, hoping this would clarify things. Instead of easing the situation, her words seemed to make the officers even more suspicious. One of them muttered under his breath, "A general? Yeah, right." The other chimed in, saying, "You don't look like any general we've ever seen." Their comments stung, but General Monroe tried to stay composed. She showed them her ID, which clearly stated her name, rank, and affiliation with the military. Yet, instead of acknowledging it, the officers dismissed it as if it meant nothing. Things escalated quickly. Despite her repeated explanations, the officers refused to believe her. They accused her of impersonating a military official and claimed there had been reports of suspicious activity in the area. Before she knew it, they were reaching for their handcuffs. General Monroe's heart sank as cold metal clicked around her wrists. How could this be happening? She was a decorated soldier, a leader who had dedicated her life to protecting her country. And yet, here she was, being treated like a criminal in her own driveway. Neighbors began to notice the commotion. Some peeked out of their windows while others came closer to see what was going on. A few people started recording the scene on their phones, capturing every painful moment. The sight of a high-ranking military officer in full uniform, handcuffed and humiliated, was shocking enough to draw attention. Whispers spread among the crowd. "Is that really a general? Why are they arresting her? What's going on?" The officers ignored the growing audience, continuing to treat General Monroe with disrespect. One of them sneered, "You think your fancy uniform makes you special? We'll see about that." These words cut deep, not because of their rudeness, but because they revealed a deeper truth. This wasn't just about mistaken identity. It was about prejudice, about assumptions based on the color of her skin rather than the content of her character. Standing there in handcuffs, General Monroe felt a mix of emotions. Anger bubbled inside her, but she forced herself to remain calm. She reminded herself of the values she had always stood for: dignity, patience, and perseverance. Still, the injustice of the situation weighed heavily on her. Here she was, someone who had risked her life for her nation, reduced to feeling powerless against two individuals who couldn't, or wouldn't, see beyond their biases. As the minutes ticked by, the tension grew thicker. Neighbors exchanged worried glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Meanwhile, the footage being recorded would soon find its way online, sparking outrage across the country. What started as a routine return home had turned into a nightmare and a story that would expose the ugly side of racism hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. Little did anyone know, this incident was just the beginning. For General Monroe, it marked the start of a journey that would test her strength, challenge the system, and ultimately lead to profound change. But for now, all she could do was stand tall, hold on to her dignity, and hope that justice would prevail. As the seconds ticked by, General Monroe stood there in handcuffs, feeling a wave of frustration and disbelief wash over her. The officer's refusal to listen or acknowledge her identity was infuriating, but she knew losing her temper wouldn't help. Instead, she took a deep breath and focused on what needed to be done next. She reminded herself that she wasn't just an ordinary citizen, she was a high-ranking officer in the U.S. military, and with that came access to resources most people didn't have. With her hands cuffed behind her back, she asked one of the officers for permission to use her phone. At first, they hesitated, exchanging glances as if trying to decide whether to allow it. But when she insisted, pointing out that she had rights even in this situation, they reluctantly handed her the device. Her fingers moved quickly despite the awkward position, dialing a number she knew by heart, the Pentagon. On the other end of the line, General Richard Hayes picked up after the second ring. He was surprised to hear from her so late at night, but his tone shifted instantly when he realized something was wrong. "General Monroe?" he asked, concern creeping into his voice. "What's going on?" She wasted no time explaining the situation. In a calm but firm voice, she told him where she was, what had happened, and how she was being treated. She made sure to emphasize that this wasn't just about her, it was about accountability and respect for the uniform she wore. By the time she finished speaking, General Hayes was silent for a brief moment, processing everything he had heard. Then, without hesitation, he assured her that action would be taken immediately. Within minutes, wheels were set in motion. General Hayes contacted local authorities to inform them of the situation, demanding an explanation for why one of their own generals was being detained. He also reached out to federal agencies, ensuring that higher powers were aware of the incident. Word spread fast, and soon, additional support was mobilized, not just from within the military but also from political figures who recognized the gravity of the moment. Back at the scene, things began to shift. Backup arrived, but not the kind the two officers expected. First came a patrol car bearing the insignia of a senior police commander. Then, another vehicle pulled up, this one carrying armed soldiers in full uniform. The sight of these reinforcements sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had gathered to watch the unfolding drama now whispered among themselves, speculating about what was happening. The commanding officer stepped forward, addressing the two cops with authority. "What exactly is going on here?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. One of the officers tried to explain, stammering nervously as he recounted their version of events. But his words sounded hollow, especially when contrasted with the presence of a decorated general standing in handcuffs. Meanwhile, the soldiers positioned themselves near General Monroe, offering her quiet reassurance. Though they couldn't remove the cuffs themselves, that would require authorization from law enforcement, they stood as a symbol of solidarity. It was clear to everyone present that this wasn't just a routine misunderstanding. It was a glaring example of systemic bias and disrespect for authority. News crews, alerted by eyewitness videos shared on social media, started arriving on the scene. Camera lights illuminated the dark street, capturing every detail of the chaotic situation. Reporters shouted questions at the officers, the crowd, and anyone else willing to speak. The story was already spreading like wildfire online, with hashtags trending across platforms. People were outraged, demanding answers and calling for justice. For the two officers, the pressure mounted. They looked increasingly uneasy as they realized the magnitude of what they had done. What had started as a routine call about suspicious activity had spiraled completely out of control. Now, they were at the center of a national scandal, facing scrutiny not only from their superiors but also from the entire country. General Monroe, still restrained, remained composed throughout the ordeal. Despite the humiliation and anger bubbling inside her, she maintained her composure, knowing that staying calm was crucial. She understood that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about exposing the flaws in a system that allowed such blatant discrimination to occur. Every camera pointed at her, every microphone thrust toward her face was an opportunity to shine a light on the issue. Finally, after what felt like hours, the handcuffs were removed. The commanding officer personally apologized to General Monroe, though his words did little to ease the sting of the experience. She nodded politely, accepting the apology, but making it clear that this wasn't the end of the matter. As she walked away from the scene, surrounded by supporters and colleagues, she knew that the fight was far from over. That night, images of General Monroe in her decorated uniform, standing tall despite being handcuffed, dominated news broadcasts and social media feeds. Commentators debated the implications of the incident, while activists called for sweeping reforms in law enforcement. For many viewers, the story hit close to home, serving as a stark reminder of the racial biases that still existed in society. As dawn approached, the nation woke up to headlines screaming variations of the same story. Black female general, handcuffed by local police. The narrative was clear: a respected leader, someone who had devoted her life to serving her country, had been treated with disdain simply because of the color of her skin. It was a wake-up call for some and a painful confirmation for others. For General Monroe, the night had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally. But as she prepared to address the public later that day, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about seeking justice for herself. It was about using her platform to push for change. She vowed to ensure that no one else would have to endure the same treatment she had faced. And so, as the sun rose over the horizon, casting light on the events of the previous night, the stage was set for a battle that would challenge not only the individuals involved, but also the institutions they represented. The morning after the incident, the story exploded across every major news outlet. It was impossible to scroll through social media or turn on the TV without seeing headlines that highlighted the shocking treatment of a decorated general. Words like humiliation, racism, and accountability dominated conversations everywhere. People were angry, not just because of what had happened to General Monroe, but because it felt all too familiar. For many, this wasn't an isolated event. It was another reminder of how deeply ingrained bias could still rear its ugly head, even in situations where respect should have been automatic. As the day went on, protests began to form outside police headquarters. Groups of people from all walks of life gathered, holding signs that read, "Respect her rank, justice for our heroes, and end racial profiling now." The crowd grew larger by the hour, fueled by shared outrage and a desire for answers. Some brought megaphones, leading chants that echoed through the streets. Others simply stood quietly, holding candles or photos of General Monroe in her uniform, as a sign of solidarity. It was clear that this wasn't just about one person anymore. It had become a movement. Inside the building, local officials scrambled to respond. They held emergency meetings trying to figure out how to handle the growing backlash. Phone lines buzzed nonstop with calls from concerned citizens, reporters, and even politicians demanding action. The pressure was intense, and everyone involved knew they couldn't afford to ignore it. Still, their initial statements were vague, filled with phrases like "under investigation" and "we are taking this seriously." To the public, these words sounded hollow. People wanted real accountability, not empty promises. Meanwhile, General Monroe prepared to address the nation. She understood the weight of the moment and knew her words would carry immense power. Flanked by supporters, including fellow veterans, civil rights activists, and community leaders, she stepped up to a podium set up in front of a packed audience. Cameras flashed, capturing every detail of her expression. Though she appeared calm and composed, there was a fire in her eyes, a determination to make sure this moment led to meaningful change. She began by recounting the events of the previous night, speaking slowly and clearly so that no one could misunderstand. She described how the officers had approached her, questioned her identity, and ultimately handcuffed her despite her explanations. Her voice remained steady, but the pain behind her words was undeniable. "I've dedicated my life to serving this country," she said, pausing briefly to let the gravity of her statement sink in. "And yet last night I was treated as though I didn't deserve respect, not because of anything I did, but because of who I am." The room fell silent as she continued. "This isn't just about me," she emphasized, looking directly into the cameras. "It's about every person who has ever been judged based on the color of their skin, instead of the content of their character. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure this kind of humiliation because of prejudice." Her speech struck a chord with millions of viewers. Social media lit up with reactions as people praised her courage and called for immediate reform. Many shared personal stories of similar experiences, adding fuel to the growing demand for systemic change. Civil rights organizations seized the opportunity to amplify their message, organizing rallies and petitions aimed at addressing racial profiling within law enforcement. Even celebrities joined the conversation, using their platforms to raise awareness and encourage donations to relevant causes. But while the public outcry intensified, cracks began to show within the police department itself. Anonymous sources leaked details about internal discussions, revealing divisions among officers. Some defended the actions of the two involved, claiming they were just doing their job and blaming the situation on a lack of proper information. Others, however, condemned the behavior, calling it unprofessional and unacceptable. These conflicting viewpoints only added to the chaos, creating tension between those who clung to old ways of thinking and those ready to embrace change. In response to the mounting pressure, city officials announced plans to launch an independent investigation into the incident. They promised transparency, vowing to release body cam footage and other evidence once it became available. While some welcomed this move, others remained skeptical, pointing out that such investigations often dragged on for months or even years without delivering justice. Protesters demanded more immediate action, chanting slogans like "No justice, no peace" outside government buildings. Amidst the chaos, General Monroe refused to let anger consume her. Instead, she channeled her energy into constructive efforts. She met with lawmakers to discuss potential reforms, sharing ideas for policies that could prevent similar incidents in the future. She also reached out to advocacy groups, offering her support and resources to help amplify their work. Her focus wasn't just on punishing the individuals responsible, it was on creating lasting change that would benefit society as a whole. By the end of the week, the story had evolved into something much bigger than anyone could have anticipated. It wasn't just about one night or one incident. It was about exposing deep-rooted issues within the system and pushing for solutions. People across the country were talking about racism, privilege, and the need for accountability in positions of power. Schools incorporated the story into classroom discussions, churches prayed for healing and unity, and workplaces hosted workshops on diversity and inclusion. For General Monroe, the days following the incident were emotionally draining. She received countless messages of support from strangers, colleagues, and even children who looked up to her as a role model. But she also faced criticism from certain corners, with some accusing her of exaggerating the situation or seeking attention. Rather than letting these comments discourage her, she used them as motivation to keep going. Every insult reminded her why the fight mattered, because progress always came with resistance. As the dust began to settle, one thing was clear. The impact of that single night would be felt for years to come. What started as a routine return home had ignited a national conversation about race, authority, and fairness. And at the center of it all stood General Monroe, a woman whose strength and resilience inspired countless others to stand up and speak out. Though the road ahead would undoubtedly be long and challenging, she remained hopeful. She believed in the goodness of people and their ability to learn, grow, and evolve. As she often said during interviews and speeches, change doesn't happen overnight, but when we come together, we can move mountains. The fallout from the incident didn't take long to hit the officers involved. As public outrage continued to grow, an internal investigation was launched almost immediately. The department knew it couldn't afford to ignore the situation, not with the entire nation watching closely. Body cam footage from the night of the incident became the centerpiece of the inquiry, and what it revealed painted a damning picture. When the videos were released to the public, after much debate and pressure from advocacy groups, it confirmed everything General Monroe had described. The footage showed how the two officers ignored her explanations, mocked her rank, and escalated the situation unnecessarily. Their body language screamed disrespect, and their tone carried an unmistakable air of dismissiveness. In one particularly jarring moment, one of the officers laughed when she mentioned her position as a general, saying, "Yeah, sure, you're a big shot." The comment sent shockwaves through viewers, who couldn't believe what they were seeing. It wasn't just negligence, it was blatant prejudice. As more details emerged, the case against the officers grew stronger. Investigators found that they had violated multiple protocols during the encounter. For starters, they failed to properly verify her identity before taking drastic action. Instead of running her ID or contacting higher authorities for confirmation, they jumped straight to handcuffing her, a move that defied standard procedure. Worse still, their behavior toward her was inconsistent with how they typically handled individuals claiming military affiliation. Witnesses later noted that white officers or civilians in uniform rarely faced such hostility. The double standard was glaringly obvious. Public sentiment reached a boiling point once the full scope of the misconduct came to light. Protesters outside police headquarters grew louder, holding signs that read, "Fire them now," and "No excuses for racism." Politicians weighed in too, calling for immediate consequences. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle condemned the officers' actions, emphasizing that no one, regardless of race, gender, or profession, should ever be subjected to such treatment. Even some members of law enforcement spoke out, acknowledging that the officers' conduct tarnished the reputation of their entire profession. Within days, disciplinary action began. Both officers were suspended without pay pending further review. But the public demanded more than just temporary suspension. They wanted accountability. Civil rights organizations filed lawsuits on behalf of General Monroe, seeking justice, not only for her, but also for others who might face similar discrimination in the future. These legal battles gained widespread attention, becoming rallying points for activists pushing for police reform. Ultimately, the officers were fired. The department issued a statement explaining that their actions were inconsistent with the values we strive to uphold, and cited gross misconduct as the reason for termination. While this decision brought some relief to those advocating for justice, it wasn't enough to quell the anger simmering beneath the surface. People wanted answers, and they wanted systemic change. But the repercussions didn't stop there. Once the officers were dismissed, criminal charges soon followed. Prosecutors argued that their behavior constituted abuse of power and violation of civil rights. The court case drew massive media coverage, with analysts dissecting every detail. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence showing that the officers had acted out of bias, pointing to past complaints against them for similar behavior. Defense attorneys tried to downplay the accusations, claiming the incident was a simple misunderstanding blown out of proportion, but the jury wasn't convinced. In the end, both officers were convicted and sentenced to serve time in prison. The verdict sent a clear message: racism and abuse of authority would not be tolerated. While some critics argued the punishment wasn't harsh enough, others saw it as a victory, a rare instance where justice prevailed over privilege. The scandal also cast a spotlight on the leadership within the police department. Questions arose about why these officers felt emboldened to act the way they did. Was it because of poor training, a toxic culture, or something deeper rooted in institutional bias? Investigations into the department's practices revealed troubling patterns of racial profiling and unequal treatment. Several high-ranking officials resigned under mounting pressure, admitting they had failed to address systemic issues within their ranks. For the officers themselves, life after conviction was bleak. Stripped of their badges, livelihoods, and reputations, they struggled to find work or reintegrate into society. Friends and family distanced themselves, ashamed of the role their loved ones had played in perpetuating injustice. Interviews conducted years later showed that one of them expressed regret, admitting he hadn't realized the harm his actions caused until it was too late. The other remained defiant, blaming the system rather than taking responsibility. Their contrasting responses highlighted the complexity of accountability, how some people learn from their mistakes while others refuse to acknowledge them. Meanwhile, General Monroe continued to use her platform to push for broader reforms. She understood that punishing the officers was only part of the solution. True change required addressing the root causes of such behavior. She worked tirelessly alongside lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in policing. One proposal focused on mandatory bias training for all officers, while another called for independent oversight boards to handle complaints of misconduct. Her efforts earned widespread support, with petitions backing her initiatives, garnering millions of signatures. The ripple effects of the scandal extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Police departments across the country began reevaluating their policies, recognizing the need to rebuild trust with marginalized communities. Some embraced reform willingly, implementing new protocols and engaging in open dialogues with residents. Others resisted, clinging to outdated methods and sparking renewed protests. But even in places where progress was slow, the conversation had shifted. People were no longer afraid to speak up about injustices they witnessed or experienced. At the same time, the incident inspired countless individuals to step forward with their own stories. Social media campaigns encouraged people to share moments when they had been profiled or mistreated due to their race, gender, or occupation. These personal accounts humanized the statistics, reminding everyone that behind every headline was a real person affected by systemic inequities. General Monroe listened to these stories, often moved to tears by the courage it took to share them. She made it a point to amplify their voices, ensuring that the movement remained inclusive and intersectional. By the time the dust settled, the impact of that single night stretched far and wide. 2 officers had lost their careers and freedom, a police department had been forced to confront its flaws, and a nation had been reminded of the urgent need for equality and fairness. But perhaps most importantly, a decorated general had risen above humiliation to become a symbol of resilience and hope. Her determination to turn pain into purpose inspired others to join the fight, proving that even in the darkest moments, change was possible. Though the journey ahead would be long and challenging, General Monroe never wavered in her belief that progress was worth fighting for. She often said, "Every step forward, even the smallest one, is a step toward a better future." And as the world watched her lead by example, it became clear that the story of that fateful night wasn't just about holding wrongdoers accountable. It was about building a world where respect and dignity were guaranteed for all. The momentum sparked by the incident didn't slow down. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing day. General Monroe realized early on that this moment wasn't just about her, it was an opportunity to push for systemic change. She knew punishing a few officers wouldn't fix the deeper problems embedded in law enforcement and society as a whole. So, she rolled up her sleeves and got to work, determined to turn tragedy into triumph. One of the first steps she took was partnering with lawmakers to draft comprehensive legislation aimed at reforming policing practices across the country. The bill, which would later be known as the Monroe Act, focused on 3 key areas: accountability, transparency, and training. It called for stricter oversight of police conduct, mandatory bias training programs, and the creation of independent review boards to investigate complaints against officers. These measures were designed not only to hold law enforcement accountable, but also to rebuild trust between communities and those sworn to protect them. General Monroe traveled tirelessly to make sure the bill gained traction. She visited state capitals, meeting with legislators who had the power to shape policy. In these meetings, she shared her personal story, emphasizing how the lack of proper safeguards had allowed such a blatant injustice to occur. Her presence alone carried weight. Here was a decorated general who had risked her life for her country, standing before them asking for basic fairness and equality. Many lawmakers couldn't help but listen, moved by her sincerity and determination. But She didn't stop there. Beyond legislative halls, General Monroe took her message directly to the people. She attended rallies, town halls, and community forums, speaking to crowds large and small. At one event in a packed auditorium, she looked out at the sea of faces and said, "Change doesn't happen because we wait for it. Change happens when we demand it." The crowd erupted in applause, many nodding in agreement. For so long they had felt powerless against a system that seemed unmovable. Now here was someone showing them that their voices mattered, and together they could make a difference. Her advocacy extended beyond speeches. She partnered with grassroots organizations, lending her support to campaigns aimed at educating the public about racial profiling and police misconduct. Together, they created workshops and seminars where people could learn how to document incidents of discrimination, file complaints, and advocate for themselves. These efforts empowered individuals to take action in their own lives, giving them tools to challenge injustice when they encountered it. Of course, not everyone welcomed the changes she championed. Some police unions pushed back hard, arguing that reforms like body cameras and civilian oversight boards would undermine officer morale and safety. They claimed that incidents like the one involving General Monroe were isolated cases blown out of proportion. But General Monroe remained undeterred. During a heated debate on national television, she calmly countered their arguments, saying, "If you're doing your job right, then transparency shouldn't scare you. Accountability isn't punishment, it's protection, both for officers and the communities they serve." Her words resonated deeply with audiences, especially those who had grown skeptical of empty promises from leaders. People admired her ability to stay composed under pressure, never letting frustration get the better of her. Even when faced with harsh criticism or outright hostility, she maintained her dignity, responding with facts and logic rather than anger. This approach earned her respect even from some of her critics, who began to see her not as an adversary, but as someone genuinely committed to improving the system. As the months went by, signs of progress started to emerge. Several cities implemented pilot programs based on recommendations from the Monroe Act. Police departments introduced new training modules focused on recognizing implicit bias and de-escalating tense situations. Others adopted policies requiring officers to intervene if they witnessed misconduct by their colleagues, a measure intended to foster accountability within the ranks. While these changes were far from perfect, they marked important steps toward meaningful reform. At the same time, the scandal prompted soul-searching within many police departments. Some embraced the reforms willingly, seeing them as opportunities to improve relationships with the communities they served. Officers attended diversity workshops, learning how to interact with people from different backgrounds with empathy and respect. Community outreach programs flourished, bringing officers and residents together for dialogue and collaboration. Slowly but surely, mistrust began to give way to understanding. However, not all departments were quick to adapt. In some areas, resistance to change ran deep. Old-school attitudes persisted, with veteran officers dismissing new policies as unnecessary or overly restrictive. Tensions flared during protests demanding further reforms, leading to clashes between demonstrators and police. These incidents served as reminders that true transformation wouldn't come easily. It required patience, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Despite these challenges, General Monroe refused to lose hope. She often reminded herself and others that progress was rarely linear. There would be setbacks along the way, moments when it felt like nothing was changing. But every small victory mattered, whether it was convincing one department to adopt body cameras or inspiring a young person to pursue a career in advocacy. Each step forward brought the nation closer to the kind of future she envisioned, one where no one had to fear being judged by the color of their skin or the uniform they wore. Her resilience inspired countless others to join the fight. Young activists looked up to her as a role model, someone who had faced adversity head-on and emerged stronger for it. Veterans rallied around her, proud to see one of their own standing up for justice. Even everyday citizens found courage in her example, realizing that they too could make a difference in their own corners of the world. By the end of the year, the Monroe Act had passed into law, marking a historic milestone in the fight for police reform. Celebrations erupted across the country, with supporters hailing it as a turning point in the struggle for equality. For General Monroe, though, the victory was bittersweet. She knew the work wasn't over. Laws alone couldn't erase centuries of prejudice. But she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. The journey had been long and grueling, but it had led to real, tangible change. Looking back, she reflected on how much had shifted since that fateful night. What had started as a deeply personal humiliation had evolved into a nationwide movement. Racism hadn't disappeared overnight, nor had distrust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. But conversations that once seemed impossible were now happening openly. Bridges were being built, however slowly, and hearts were beginning to open. For General Monroe, the ultimate reward wasn't fame or recognition. It was knowing that she had used her platform to lift others up. She often said, "I may have been the spark, but the fire belongs to everyone who stood with me." And as she continued to speak, write, and advocate for justice, it became clear that her legacy would endure, not just as a symbol of resilience, but as a beacon of hope for generations to come. Years had passed since that unforgettable night, but its impact lingered in ways no one could have predicted. General Patricia Monroe eventually retired from active duty, leaving behind a career defined not just by medals and accolades, but by her unwavering commitment to justice. Her decision to step away from the military wasn't made lightly. It came after years of tireless advocacy, countless speeches, and sleepless nights spent drafting policies and meeting with lawmakers. Yet even in retirement, she remained a force to be reckoned with, continuing to inspire change from the sidelines. The Monroe Act, now a cornerstone of modern policing reform, transformed how law enforcement operated across the United States. Departments adopted stricter guidelines for officer conduct, including mandatory bias training and clear protocols for handling complaints. Independent review boards became standard practice, giving citizens a voice when they felt wronged by those meant to protect them. Body cameras, once controversial, were embraced as tools for transparency rather than threats to authority. Slowly but surely, communities began to see shifts, not perfect solutions but meaningful progress. But perhaps the most profound legacy of General Monroe's fight was the cultural shift it sparked. Conversations about race, privilege, and accountability, once considered taboo or uncomfortable, entered mainstream discourse. Schools incorporated lessons on systemic racism into their curriculums, helping young minds understand the importance of fairness and equality. Workplaces implemented diversity training programs, encouraging employees to confront their biases and treat each other with respect. Even families gathered around dinner tables to discuss these topics, passing down values of empathy and justice to future generations. For many people, General Monroe's story served as both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. It reminded them that prejudice could rear its head anywhere, even in places where respect should have been automatic. But it also showed that standing firm in the face of injustice could spark monumental change. Countless individuals credited her courage with empowering them to speak out against discrimination in their own lives. Whether it was a young student challenging stereotypes in class, or a seasoned professional confronting workplace inequities, the ripple effects of her actions reached far and wide. Her influence extended beyond policy changes and social movements. It touched hearts on a deeply personal level. Statues were erected in her honor, depicting her standing tall in uniform, a symbol of resilience and strength. Books chronicled her life, detailing not only her achievements but also her struggles and triumphs. Awards bearing her name were established to recognize others who fought for justice and equality. People looked at her not just as a hero, but as a human being who had faced adversity and emerged stronger because of it. Yet despite all the recognition, General Monroe remained humble. She often said, "This isn't about me. It's about what we can do together." And true to her word, she continued to support grassroots efforts, amplifying the voices of those still fighting for change. She traveled across the country, visiting small towns and big cities alike, speaking to anyone willing to listen. Her message was simple yet powerful. True strength lies not in never falling, but in rising every time you do. In quieter moments, she reflected on her journey. The highs and lows, the victories and setbacks. There were days when the weight of everything felt overwhelming, when the memories of that night crept back into her mind. But instead of letting bitterness take root, she chose gratitude. She thanked the neighbors who had stood up for her, the soldiers who had rushed to her aid, and the millions of strangers who had rallied behind her cause. Their collective support reminded her that she wasn't alone, that humanity at its core was capable of incredible compassion. As time went on, the world began to notice subtle yet significant improvements. Police departments reported fewer incidents of racial profiling, thanks in part to better training and oversight. Communities grew more willing to engage with law enforcement, participating in town halls and neighborhood patrols designed to foster mutual understanding. While challenges remained, the atmosphere had shifted. There was hope where there had once been despair. General Monroe's later years were filled with quiet satisfaction. She spent her days mentoring young activists, sharing wisdom gained through decades of experience. She wrote letters to students studying history, urging them to learn from the past while striving for a brighter future. She planted trees in her backyard, seeing them as symbols of growth and renewal. Life slowed down, but her spirit remained as vibrant as ever. When she passed away peacefully at home, surrounded by loved ones, the nation mourned the loss of a trailblazer. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe, celebrating her contributions to society. Flags flew at half-mast and vigils were held in her honor. Yet even in death, her presence lingered. People carried her teachings with them, passing them on to others like a torch lighting the way forward. Today, statues of General Monroe stand proudly in parks and public squares, reminders of what one person can achieve when they refuse to back down. Schools bear her name, educating children about the value of perseverance and integrity. And though she is gone, her legacy endures, not just in laws or monuments, but in the hearts of those she inspired. Because of her, the world became a little kinder, a little fairer. Bridges were built where walls once stood, and conversations replaced silence. Her story proved that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through, if someone was brave enough to ignite it. And so, General Patricia Monroe's life became a testament to the power of resilience, courage, and unity. She may have started as a single voice speaking out against injustice, but her words echoed across generations, proving that true change begins not with grand gestures, but with ordinary people choosing to stand up for what's right.